The summer of 1944 witnessed the complete disintegration of the German army in the West. Following the catastrophic defeat at the Falaise Pocket in Normandy, the Wehrmacht was not retreating, it was fleeing. The roads leading back to the German border were clogged with the burning wreckage of convoys, abandoned Tiger tanks, and exhausted soldiers who had lost their will to fight. To the Allied commanders, it felt like the end. The 1,000-year Reich was collapsing in real time. But to the German generals watching the map tables in Berlin and the Western headquarters, the situation was even more terrifying than the Allies realized. They knew a secret that, had Dwight D. Eisenhower acted upon it, could have ended World War II by Christmas 1944. General Gunther Blumentritt, the chief of staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, later provided one of the most chilling assessments of this moment. In post-war interrogations, he stripped away the propaganda and revealed the naked truth of September 1944. He described the German Western Front as a house of cards. The mighty Siegfried Line, the West Wall that was supposed to protect the German homeland, was a ghost town. The concrete bunkers were empty. The guns had been stripped to be sent to the Eastern Front. There were no reserves. There were no tanks. There was no ammunition. At that time, Blumentritt later admitted, there were no German forces behind the Rhine. A single breakthrough, and the war would have been over. This was the open door. The great northern plain lay exposed. General Rundstedt and Manteuffel, one of Germany's most capable panzer commanders, looked at his depleted units and realized he couldn't stop a dedicated Boy Scout troop, let alone an American armored division. Field Marshal Walter Model, known as the Führer's fireman for his ability to save impossible situations, arrived in the theater and found chaos. He reported that he didn't have an army, he had a chaotic mob. The German High Command held its breath, waiting for the final blow. They fully expected General George Patton or Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery to punch through the undefended gap and roll straight into the Ruhr, the industrial heart of Germany. Losing the Ruhr meant the German war machine would suffocate within weeks. But then, the impossible happened. The miracle that the German generals prayed for was not delivered by their own tactical genius, but by Allied logistics and strategy. The Allied engines went silent. General Eisenhower, managing a massive coalition and a strained supply line, made the controversial decision to adhere to his broad front strategy. Instead of funneling all available fuel and ammunition into a single razor-sharp spearhead to pierce the open German defenses, he spread the resources across the entire line to keep all armies moving, albeit slowly. On the German side, the generals watched in disbelief as the American tanks stopped. They weren't stopped by anti-tank fire or minefields. They stopped because they had run out of gas. The furious pursuit turned into a lethargic crawl. General Siegfried Westphal, another senior German commander, noted the bewildered relief among the staff. The enemy has paused, the reports came in. That pause was the difference between life and death for the Nazi regime. In those critical weeks of September, while the Allies reorganized and waited for fuel, the German army achieved the miracle of the West. They scraped together old men and teenage boys. They rushed spare parts to the front, and they manned the empty bunkers of the Siegfried Line. The door that had been kicked wide open was slowly, creakingly slammed shut. The German generals knew they had been handed a gift. Eisenhower had held the knockout blow in his hand, and he had hesitated. The price of that hesitation would be paid in the freezing forests of the Ardennes and the bloody battles of the Hürtgen Forest. The war would not end in 1944. Because the door was closed, the killing would continue for another 8 agonizing months. September 1944. The Allied armies were racing across France, drunk on victory.
Paris had been liberated, and the German army was fleeing in disarray. But as the tanks of the Third Army and the British 21st Army Group sped toward the German border, they hit an enemy more formidable than the Wehrmacht: logistics. The Allied supply lines were stretched to the breaking point. Every gallon of gasoline, every bullet, and every tin of rations had to be trucked from the beaches of Normandy, hundreds of miles away. The Red Ball Express, the famous convoy system, was burning more fuel delivering the supplies than the tanks at the front were actually using. The Allied war machine was running on fumes. A crisis was inevitable. The question was not if the armies would stop, but which army would be allowed to keep going. This logistical nightmare set the stage for the most heated strategic debate of the war in Western Europe. It was a clash of titans, of egos, and of national pride. In one corner stood Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery, the British commander. In the other were the American generals Omar Bradley and the fiery George Patton. And in the middle, trying to hold the coalition together, was Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. Montgomery's argument was cold, mathematical, and strategically sound. He proposed the single thrust. He argued that since there wasn't enough fuel for everyone to attack, the Allies should halt all other sectors. Patton should stop. Bradley should stop. All available resources, every drop of gasoline, and every transport truck should be given to his 21st Army Group in the north. Monty proposed a massive, concentrated 40-division dagger thrust through Belgium, over the Rhine, and straight into the Ruhr industrial heartland. He famously told Eisenhower, "Give me the resources and I will end the war by Christmas." To the German generals watching from the other side of the hill, this was their nightmare scenario. They knew they had no reserves to stop a concentrated heavy punch. If the Allies put all their weight behind one fist, the German line would shatter. But Eisenhower said no. Ike was not just a general, he was a politician managing a delicate international alliance. He knew that ordering the American armies to sit idle while the British claimed the glory of entering Berlin would destroy the morale of the U.S. forces and cause a political firestorm in Washington. Furthermore, Eisenhower was by nature a cautious planner. He feared that a single thrust would create a long, narrow flank that the Germans could cut off, surrounding and destroying the British army. Instead, Eisenhower chose the broad front strategy. He decided to keep everyone moving. He split the limited supplies. He gave some to Monty in the north and some to Patton in the south. He wanted to stretch the German defenses along the entire border, probing for weaknesses everywhere. It was a safe decision, but militarily it was a fatal compromise. By trying to attack everywhere, the Allies lacked the strength to break through anywhere. The broad front diluted the Allied power. Patton ran out of gas just as he was about to smash into the Saar. Montgomery's thrust was weakened, leading to the gamble of Operation Market Garden, which ended in disaster at Arnhem. The momentum died. The broad front bought the Germans exactly what they needed most: time. The pressure on the Wehrmacht eased just enough for them to dig in. The compromise preserved the alliance, but it sacrificed the opportunity for a quick victory. Eisenhower's decision to play it safe meant that the war would not end by Christmas. Instead, it would drag on into the freezing winter, leading to the Battle of the Bulge and thousands of additional casualties. The fatal compromise had turned a sprint into a slog. In the first week of September 1944, the mood inside the headquarters of O.B. West, the German command for the Western Front, was not one of defiance, but of liquidation. Officers were burning secret documents in oil drums. Staff cars were packed with looted French wine and artwork, engines idling, ready to race back across the Rhine. The Wehrmacht was broken. The retreat from France had been a catastrophe of biblical proportions, with entire armies evaporating in the Falaise pocket. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the aristocratic old man of the German army, had been reinstated as Commander-in-Chief West. He stared at the maps with the weary cynicism of a man who had seen too much war. He knew the reality better than anyone. Between the charging American tanks and the German border, there was nothing. No organized defensive line, no reserves, no air cover. Rundstedt famously remarked to his staff that the only order left to give was to make peace, you fools. He expected the Allies to cross the Rhine within the week. But then, the unthinkable happened. The silence. The relentless roar of the Allied advance began to sputter and die. General Patton's tanks, which had been devouring French territory at a rate of 50 miles a day, ground to a halt. The British in the north stopped to regroup. The reports flooding into Rundstedt's headquarters changed from panic to bewildered disbelief. The Americans weren't stopping because of resistance, they were stopping because of logistics. Eisenhower's decision to advance on a broad front had drained the Allied fuel reserves dry. To the German generals, this was not just a respite, it was divine intervention. It was, as General Hasso von Manteuffel later described it, a gift from the enemy. They did not waste a single hour of this gift. What followed is known in military history as the miracle of the West. While the Allies waited for gasoline, the Germans unleashed a ruthless reorganization. Field Marshal Walter Model, a man known for his brutal energy, scoured the rear areas. He set up checkpoints at every bridge and crossroads. Every soldier retreating from France, whether he was a cook, a clerk, a mechanic, or a straggler without a weapon, was stopped. If he could walk, he was given a rifle and sent back to the line. Model created Volksgrenadier divisions out of thin air. He formed stomach battalions made up of men with ulcers and digestive problems who had previously been deemed unfit for combat. He emptied the naval bases and the Luftwaffe ground crews. It was a ragtag army of old men, boys, and the infirm, but it was an army. Simultaneously, they resurrected the West Wall, the Siegfried Line. For years, these massive concrete bunkers along the German border had been neglected, used as potato cellars by local farmers, their guns stripped and sent to the Eastern Front. But in the precious weeks of September that Eisenhower gifted them, the Germans rushed to reopen the tombs. They moved artillery pieces into position. They laid thousands of mines in the Hürtgen forest. They dug anti-tank ditches. By the time the Allied fuel trucks finally arrived and the American engines roared back to life in October, the open door was gone. The Americans did not face a broken mob anymore. They drove headlong into a solidified wall of concrete and fanaticism. The miracle of the West was complete. The Germans had used the pause to pull themselves back from the brink of extinction, ensuring that the road to Berlin would not be a victory parade, but a bloodbath. Eisenhower's hesitation had allowed the dying beast to stand up and bite one last time.
The bill for the broad front strategy came due on the freezing morning of December 16, 1944. For months, the Ardennes forest had been known among American troops as the Ghost Front. It was a quiet, snow-covered sector where nothing ever happened. The Allied command used it as a resting ground for battered divisions recovering from the Hürtgen forest, and a training ground for green recruits who had never heard a shot fired in anger. The silence of the forest was seductive. It lulled the Allies into a false sense of security. Intelligence officers in Versailles were confident that the German war machine was broken, incapable of mounting anything more than a local counterattack. They believed the Wehrmacht was gasping its last breath. They were fatally wrong.
The quiet in the Ardennes was not peace, it was the holding of breath before a scream. While Eisenhower's armies had been slowly grinding forward along the entire border, diluted and stretched thin by the broad front approach, Adolf Hitler had been using the time purchased by the Allied hesitation to gamble everything. He stripped the Eastern Front of its best armor. He conscripted the last reserves of German manpower. Under the cover of heavy winter fog that grounded Allied reconnaissance planes, he secretly massed 3 entire armies, over 200,000 men and nearly 1,000 tanks, directly opposite the weakest point in the American line. This was the direct consequence of the miracle of the West. The soldiers who should have been captured in September and the tanks that should have been destroyed in the Ruhr were now waiting in the tree line, engines idling. German generals Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th Panzer Army, and Hasso von Manteuffel of the 5th Panzer Army, looked at the American positions with predatory focus. They knew the terrain was difficult, narrow roads, deep ravines, thick forests, but they also saw the fatal flaw in Eisenhower's deployment. The American line was terrifyingly thin. In some sectors, a single platoon was responsible for holding miles of front. Manteuffel later remarked on the stunning lack of depth in the American defenses. He realized that if he punched hard enough, there was nothing behind the crust to stop him. At 5:30 a.m., the silence of the Ghost Front was shattered. The horizon erupted in flashes of orange and red as 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The earth shook. Trees were splintered into deadly shrapnel. Inside the American foxholes, young soldiers woke up to the apocalypse. Before the shelling even lifted, the shapes of King Tiger and Panther tanks emerged from the mist, looking like prehistoric monsters. The shock was absolute. "They're not supposed to have any tanks left," one American officer screamed into a radio that had gone dead. The German onslaught tore a massive 50-mile gap in the Allied line. This was the Battle of the Bulge. For the German commanders, it was a moment of grim satisfaction. They were inflicting the punishment for the Allies' earlier hesitation. Eisenhower had given them the autumn to recover, and now they were using the winter to try and break the Western alliance. Manteuffel's panzers raced toward the Meuse River, bypassing strongpoints, creating panic and chaos in the American rear. For a few terrifying days, it looked as if the Germans might actually split the British and American armies in two. The broad front strategy had relied on the assumption that the Germans were too weak to exploit the gaps between the Allied armies. The Battle of the Bulge proved that assumption to be a bloody error. The Americans would eventually win the battle, rallying with desperate courage at places like Bastogne and Elsenborn Ridge, but the cost of the victory was exorbitant. Over 19,000 Americans were killed, and nearly 90,000 became casualties. It was the bloodiest battle the United States fought in World War II. Every soldier who died in the snow of the Ardennes was a tragic testament to the opportunity lost in September. If the knockout blow had been delivered when the door was open, the Battle of the Bulge would never have happened. The ghosts of the Ardennes were the price paid for letting the enemy stand back up.
April 1945. The Third Reich was a burning skeleton. The outcome of the war was no longer in doubt. The only question remaining was who would dance on the grave of Adolf Hitler. To the west, the American Ninth Army, commanded by General William Simpson, had raced across the Elbe River. They were 53 miles from Berlin. The road ahead was virtually undefended. To the east, the Soviet Red Army was still fighting its way through the fanatical resistance on the Seelow Heights. The prize was there for the taking. General Simpson radioed headquarters, "We are ready to push on to Berlin." His troops were eager. Taking the enemy capital is the ultimate soldier's dream. But then a message arrived from Supreme Headquarters that stunned the world and sealed the fate of millions.
Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered the armies to halt. Berlin, Eisenhower famously declared, is nothing but a geographical location. He viewed it as a prestige objective that was not worth a single American life. He estimated that taking the city would cost 100,000 casualties, and since the Yalta Conference had already designated Berlin as part of the Soviet zone of occupation, he saw no point in bleeding for territory he would just have to hand over to Stalin later. To the German generals and the terrifyingly vulnerable civilians, this decision was the final, cruelest blow of the war. They were not fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting for survival. And survival meant one thing: surrender to the Americans, not the Russians. The reputation of the Red Army preceded it. Tales of mass rape, looting, and brutal vengeance terrified the German population. The German strategy in the final weeks was entirely focused on holding the Eastern Front just long enough to let the civilians and soldiers flee west into the arms of the Americans. They were literally holding the door open, begging Eisenhower to walk through it. General Walther Wenck, commanding the 12th Army, became the tragic hero of this final act. Realizing that Hitler was insane and the war was lost, Wenck ignored orders to save the Führer in his bunker. Instead, he turned his army around and fought a desperate battle against the Soviets, not to win, but to create a corridor. His goal was to escort hundreds of thousands of refugees and soldiers to the Elbe River, to the American lines. At the bridge at Tangermünde, a scene of biblical desperation unfolded. The shattered remnants of the 9th and 12th German armies, along with a sea of weeping civilians, pressed against the riverbank. On the other side stood the Americans, weapons lowered, watching the Russians approach. The Germans swam across the icy water, floated on tire tubes, and climbed over the wrecked bridge girders, desperate to reach the saving bank of the Elbe before the Soviets arrived. When the Red Army finally took Berlin, the nightmare that the Germans had feared became reality. The city was sacked. The screams of the populace echoed through the ruins. Winston Churchill had warned Eisenhower. He had argued that we should shake hands with the Russians as far to the east as possible. He foresaw that if the Allies stopped, they would be handing half of Europe over to a new tyranny. But Eisenhower, ever the soldier and never the politician, stuck to his military logic. The verdict of history and of the German generals who survived is complex. Eisenhower undoubtedly saved American lives in the short term, but by stopping at the Elbe, he allowed the Iron Curtain to descend in the middle of Europe. The mistake of not taking Berlin meant that the victory over Nazism was immediately followed by the freeze of the Cold War. For the people of Eastern Europe, the liberation stopped at the riverbank, and the long night began. Eisenhower had won the war, but in the eyes of many, he had lost the peace.